waiting on a few more people to arrive, a few more participants before we kick it off. I might just start by introducing myself. My name's Alan Hicks. I'm the National Secretary of the ETU. I'm also the New South Wales Branch Secretary of the New South Wales ACT Branch Secretary of the ETU as well. So I just want to welcome everyone here tonight. I just want to start with a few housekeeping issues. We're going to go through obviously an introduction, and then we've got a number of guest speakers that are going to be providing some information for you tonight around obviously this campaign. And then at the end of those, we're going to ask for people to do a Q&A session. The way that's going to be conducted is obviously, if you can have a look at the bottom of your screen, there's a capacity there to click on that Q&A, and then we'd ask you to type in your questions, and that way you can either direct them directly to each of the respective panelists if you wish, or if it's just a general question, then I'll try and deal with that and moderate it the best way I can. We've also got Emma, our communications person, that will try and assist with some of those questions as well, and she'll be able to try and provide direct feedback. If it's a simple question and it's an easy answer, if it's not and it needs to go to one of the panelists, then we'll try and direct it that way. So like I said, my name's Alan Hicks, and I want to welcome everyone here tonight. Also want to just give you a bit of a background on the ETU and the CEPU before I start. So the Electrical Trades Union obviously is a division of the CEPU. We have around 61,000 members that work in Australia, and we largely represent obviously electrical and electrode technology tradespeople and apprentices. We've been doing it for well over 100 years, right around the country, and we're part of a much larger organisation, larger union called the CEPU, and they have about 100,000 workers. In the spirit of reconciliation, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Of that 61,000 members, sadly at this point in time, women in our union make up about 2%. And that's not something that as I said, I'm proud of, but it's something that we're working hard to try and change, and we've been doing that for some time. Initially, the union moved to trying to build some informal structures within our union to support women in the electrical industry. And then more recently, we've established permanent structures throughout organisational rules changes. And then also through the years, ETU branches and CEPU branches have supported delegations to participate in inter-union forums at the ACTU, Women's Committee, at conferences, at WIMDOI, Women and Male Dominated Industry Conferences. And in particular, in the early days, branches like Queensland set up internal structures and established dedicated women's committees and started off with an annual ETU Women's Conference. The work of all of that in the early days led to a decision and a milestone, I guess, that the ETU reached in 2016. And that's when the ETU Divisional Council, our supreme governing body, unanimously voted to change the rules of our organisation to create affirmative action positions in all state and federal governance bodies of the union. And I have to admit that it was well overdue, and we should have done that many, many years ago. But the group of secretaries, the divisional councillors that we have, obviously back in 2016, took a strong stance to make sure that women were adequately represented in our union. And the great part about that, or the ironic part about that, is once we got through all of the rules changes through our formal governance processes, the actual rules change was ratified by the Fair Work Commission on International Women's Day in March 2016. And then the first time we had the opportunity to actually formally elect women and affirmative action people right across our union was in 2019, and that was a great moment for our union. Obviously, following this, affirmative action positions were created, and rank and file ETU women nominated and secured positions in all of the governance structures of the union, from the branch conferences right through to the branch executives, as well as nationally that we have on our divisional council and a divisional executive. And then the creation of a national ETU affirmative action women's officer, who we'll get to meet shortly. Before I kick off with respect to inviting some of our guest speakers to talk about their experiences, I just want to acknowledge and thank the many ETU and CEPU women and in particular the ETU Women's Committee, who kicked this campaign off and who instigated this report. Also the affirmative action representatives for generously sharing their experiences with us. And I think we now have to acknowledge how frank and honest they were with their feedback towards their experiences, and obviously their support of this report. I want to start by introducing Alan McNally. I've asked each of the guest speakers today to provide a bit of a bio, and Alan McNally is obviously the ETU National Women's Officer, and that's a great opportunity for me to introduce her. But I'm just going to read her bio because I know how Alan is, and if I don't read her bio out the way she wants me to, then she'll let me know about it. Alan McNally has been the ETU National Women's Officer since International Men's Day, which actually coincided with International Toilet Day in 2019. She was also elected in 2019 as the New South Wales ACT Women's Officer. Alan has worked in the electrical industry for most of her adult life and has been a workplace delegate of the power industry for the ETU since 2003. In 2020, she was elected a representative of the ACTU executive for the whole of the CEPU and sits on a number of committees within her branch as a fierce advocate for equity and equality. Outside of union life, she balances a 24/7 shift roster with being a mum of 2 kids. And on Wednesday, she likes to smash the patriarchy. So I'll just want to welcome Alan McNally and hand it over to you. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Alan. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Wadi Wadi people of the Illawarra that are part of the Dharawal Nation as the traditional custodians of the land in which I'm currently on, which is also where I live and I work. I pay respects to their elders, past, present and future. I'm so grateful for this opportunity to discuss this issue, because for so many people, this is a significant issue that impacts members of the ETU and the electrical divisions of the CEPU right across Australia. Regardless of branch, state, industry or employer, almost every member has a horror story relating to facilities at work. And their tips and tricks of managing it are often passed from tradie to apprentice, like so many of the other skills that we learn as part of our trades. But the undisputable facts are that inadequate, abhorrent, and absent amenities in workplaces disproportionately impact on women due to biological norms outside of their control. Unfortunately, still today, women in electrical industries and trades in most workplaces remain a firm minority, as Alan had indicated earlier. This can make it very intimidating to speak up and very easy for women's needs to be ignored, belittled, simply overlooked in our workplaces, and particularly when there is an absence of legislation to require those needs to be met. This paper started from small beginnings, comparing notes between power companies on how long it takes to change a pole, and discussing accessibility issues experienced often by female apprentices on an all-male crew. And throughout the paper, our female members have told their real and personal stories and concerns to ensure that they are not only heard, but experiences are improved in hope that it removes some of the barriers and stigma for women going into these industries. Because whilst today women in electrical still may be few, they are also mighty and stronger than they are often seen or given credit for. Our National Women's Committee has done an amazing job in pulling together women from all over the country. We need to acknowledge their efforts as rank and file women volunteering their time to create real change for women at work. I don't know how many meetings ran over or how many phone calls and emails were exchanged to get here, but as a working woman myself, I know how precious a commodity personal time can be, but I also know many hands make light work. I want to acknowledge our union community for supporting each other, because this has involved difficult conversations. The sheer number of women reporting having been locked out or locked in toilets by employers, and the bullying and harassment experienced on a daily basis for issues outside of a woman's control has been a difficult conversation for these people to relive and for those that have had to hear. I hope that this is a journey to empowerment, as we speak no longer as just one voice, but instead as the voice of many. We want to see the 10 recommendations that are based on the feedback from our women all over Australia and their experiences being talked about openly rather than whispered. Recently in the media, there's been discussions around new EBA conditions, with a number of workplaces introducing paid menstruation leave for women at work, which is really applaudable. But it often makes me wonder how things like secure, safe and sanitary amenities are seen by some as almost reinventing the wheel. As an industry and trade that prides itself on being the god of all trades, surely we are able to appreciate the challenges that women face. And interestingly, anecdotally, we also find that a large number of women in electrical trades often have male family members also from the trade. This has a little bit to do with the high voltage exposure levels that some people believe lead to higher numbers of female babies. But surely this is a good reason to ensure we leave our industry in a better place than how we found it. As part of our recommendations, education, understanding and compliance form a major part of the change required in workplace conditions. And having recently watched Misrepresented with Annabelle Crabb, I was surprised to see just how many experiences women in our union share with women in Parliament. Just like Parliament House, our workplaces are frequently built with minimal and sometimes no consideration for women in the workforce now or in the future. As a minority, we too are often questioned about our merit for the jobs that we do, and yet nobody ever doubts the merit of our male peers the same. These shared experiences hopefully will assist us in engaging those legislators and political leaders and understanding why these matter to women and why the 10 recommendations from this paper will create the necessary change. Further to this, educating them on the importance and why introducing workplace change, particularly on the run to the 25 by 25 G20 target, needs the involvement of women who actually have the experiences of being in these industries and not just their workplace leaders. Having these women's experiences helps to identify and remove the barriers for increased participation in our industry that we so sorely need. Hopefully this is the start of something that we can all see, engage and nurture well into the future, so that it one day will become one of those stories future generations just shake their heads in disbelief about. And thank you all for participating today.
Thanks very much, Alan. I really appreciate it. Spoken always with intent and purpose. So thank you for that. The next speaker that we have tonight on our panel is Izzy. Izzy's an electrician and a proud ETU member of Victoria. She's passionate about working in the renewable sector and has been successful in securing various contract-based positions on large-scale solar and wind farms in the last 3 years. She's always been passionate about working in the trade, and due to the increased visibility of women on the tools, got the courage to join in as an adult apprentice in 2014. We've asked Izzy tonight to speak about her experiences of herself and the women she's worked with. So welcome, Izzy.
Thank you very much, Alan. So I'm zooming in from Victoria, which are the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So I started my apprenticeship in 2014 and was very fortunate enough to secure my apprenticeship with a direct employer who was also quite heavily unionised workforce. But that didn't necessarily mean that I was always afforded access that was easy to bathrooms, amenities, or sanitary bins, because this was often in the control of the builder and not my direct employer. And so not really, my direct employer only had so much clout that they could play with a builder, and a builder would often use the bare minimum workplace codes or legislative requirements. So sometimes due to the workforce not having enough toilets, and this includes my male colleagues, if I was given a single female bathroom on site, this was often vandalized by my male colleagues in an angry protest to the builder who failed to provide enough toilets for the general workforce. But obviously, like, I would suffer, and the other few females on site would suffer the most out of these actions. So we would speak up at meetings with the builder and say that more toilets would be needed. Things like our toilets being locked and having to ask permission to access the toilets would sometimes be an issue. I worked on the Grand Prix where unfortunately a female jogger went into one of the accessible portable toilets and was assaulted. And so all of the female toilets on site were locked and we could not access them. And this was done for our safety. However, the ease of access was made extremely difficult because we would have to walk around for anywhere between 20 minutes trying to find a security guard with a key to the toilet, and then have them escort us to the bathroom and wait outside while we went to the toilet, and then lock it after we left. We requested for a phone number to the security guards and were denied. And so sometimes access can be made extremely difficult, even though those amenities do exist on site and the builder or the work site employer has done the right thing by providing them. Access is not always easy. When I've done away work and remote work on solar and wind farms, access and ease of access becomes like a really huge problem. So compounds, which are the main places where we gather in the morning, where we break for lunch, and where we sometimes pack up at the end of the day, will be built with portable toilets, which have light, power, running water, sanitary bins. But because the compound can be anywhere between 10 and 25 kilometers away from where you are working, access becomes an even more problematic issue. Depending on how many farmers' lands you need to traverse and how many farm gates and stock gates you need to move through, access becomes increasingly more problematic for the workforce at large. And so when I worked on wind farms specifically, people going to the toilet out in the bush, out in a field, behind a transformer, like behind a wind turbine, or just behind a ute, became like a regular occurrence. And it was just like an accepted fact that this was a part of working in remote work. And often speaking to employers about this lack of amenities or this difficulty to access the toilet was often just faced with, well, there's a toilet back at the compound, so you should just be able to make it there. And it didn't really face the fact that if you were at the top of a turbine, you had to climb a ladder that could be anywhere between 80 and 110 meters. You had to put on your safety gear, attach it, climb it down. You had to tell your co-workers that you needed to go to the toilet. You would need to stop what you were doing. If you were only working with another colleague, you would both have to stop. You would both have to descend the tower for safety reasons, because you need to always be working together in pairs. And so this can become highly problematic. And so my male colleagues respectfully would try to minimize the disruption to each other by just peeing in bottles. Obviously, that's a little bit more difficult for me. And I tried using Shiwis and other devices to make my efforts on site seem less problematic to my work crews, but they were very sympathetic to the problems that I faced. Even sometimes managers that I would speak to were very sympathetic. But there was a lack of maturity when I tried to discuss these issues with them. And many women have faced these issues when a lack of maturity comes into the spectrum. I asked an employer for the ability for them to purchase disposable sanitary bags that I could dispose of sanitary items on the go while I was working in these rural conditions. And they kind of just replied to me that they didn't want to know what I did out there, and they didn't want to have that discussion, and that there were amenities at the compound, and that's all that they needed to provide. And they didn't want to discuss it any further. So sometimes female members, and many of our members, have had very frank conversations, which for them are also quite embarrassing, but they've mustered up the courage and maturity to have them with their employer, but their employer doesn't have the maturity or courage to have that frank conversation with them. So there are things that I believe can be improved in the industry, both in rural as well as maintenance yards. Women having to use unisex toilets that haven't been properly retrofitted for a male and female workforce, where women have to walk past their male colleagues peeing against a wall in full view of themselves, or wash their hands where the mirror shows their male colleague peeing against a wall. These kinds of places have done the bare minimum to meet the regulations and the work safe requirements. And the fact that that's what the bare minimum is unfortunate and really needs to change. I feel like workplaces and employers just need to put a little bit of effort into the mature discussion with their workforces about putting in a privacy screen for those workers that can access a urinal wall, installing additional stalls in a couple places where they want to use unisex toilets. Most of the time, I feel like the solutions are quite simple, but that there is an idea that it's too hard, it's too difficult to discuss, is unfortunate. I love the outdoors and I really love working in remote sectors. I really enjoyed my time working in wind and solar. I love camping and I love nature at large, but going to the bathroom in the middle of a farmer's field has problems attached to it when there's a massive work site around you and when there are workers performing work around you and a farmer can access those lands. There needs to be a little bit more support, both for men and women in rural sectors. And in regards to working on more established places, many of the women within the Victorian Women's Committee have shared terrible stories about having conversations with their employer where, because a work site was all male and they've entered it as the first female on that work site, there are no amenities provided for them. And they have to repeatedly broach these subjects of, where can I go to the bathroom? Where can I dispose of sanitary items? Where can I express breast milk? It's an especially problematic issue for mothers who are returning to the workforce and have a complete lack of support when it comes to expressing breast milk and storing breast milk. Pointing a woman to a portaloo to express breast milk that they later want to feed to their children is not an appropriate solution. Another problem some of our workforces face is that when they try to broach the subject, immediately employers reply with the monetary cost or the monetary burden that this is going to impose upon them to cater to women in the workforce. And this is an unfortunate thing that is said to women that is used to shut them down. I really wish that this wasn't the automatic reaction, because I feel like a lot of employers don't view the benefits of improving amenities on site for their workforce morale. It improves it for everybody. And often the costs are not that significant. Yeah.
Thank you, Izzy. I really appreciate your efforts, and it was well said. I mean, to actually listen to some of the real life experiences and the practical examples that you've just given, some simple examples that you've given that, principal contractors and builders, employers can put in place practical things that would assist in addressing some of these issues. It doesn't obviously address all of them, is why this report and your input to this is valuable, because if employers want to do the right thing, then they absolutely can. But obviously, always there's some resistance, and always comes back down to dollars and cents. And that's why we as a union are pretty proud to launch this report and do whatever we can to try and improve those workplaces. Thank you.
Welcome.
The next person that I want to introduce to you tonight is Trevor Gould. Trev's been the National Policy Officer for the ETU since I think around 2017. And during this time, he's provided high-level political and policy advice to the union across a broad range of policy areas that impact our members. He also represents the union interest on a variety of committees, boards, and advisory councils, both at a state and a federal level. Trev's got a background as a linesman, a cable joiner, and a fitter, and I know Trev's worked tirelessly on this report. And he's done some great work, and I've asked him tonight to highlight some of the key themes from the report and the key recommendations. So thanks, Trev.
Thanks, Ixie. I'm joining you all from Meanjin, the lands of the Turrbal and the Jagera peoples, and I want to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. I want to echo Hicksey's thanks to the ETU women who contributed to this report for their significant generosity and trust in sharing their experiences. And as Hicksey outlined, I'm going to try and provide you a short overview of the key themes that are contained within the report. It's now, I believe, in the a link in the chat there, so you should be able to grab it all from the ETU National's Facebook page, and also an overview of the recommendations. What the report found is that inadequate workplace amenities is an unacceptable risk impacting ETU members across the board, but it's substantially worse for ETU women, both in the frequency and severity of those impacts. And by addressing how it affects those impacted the most, we can ensure we lift the standards for everyone, making sure we improve standards for all workers while also removing a substantial barrier to women's participation in the industry, which also then addresses issues like absenteeism, morale, and increases productivity. Everyone wins. So the three key themes that we found through this report was that too many employers are failing to provide adequate amenities and are failing to respond to the changing demographic of their workforce. Broadly, we saw this coming from several factors, including many employers simply not understanding there are different needs of different workers and inadvertently reinforcing the status quo, or that they aren't making the effort or just don't know how to ask. We know that some employers are consciously refusing to, reinforcing cultural and systemic barriers, or knowing that they can simply get away with it and cut costs. And then that affects some employers who want to, but find it difficult because they're simply being priced out by their competitors who deliberately don't and are cutting those costs. So that caused us to turn our mind to, what about the regulators? Why aren't they enforcing it? And what we found is that the regulators are not performing adequate education, compliance, and enforcement activities in relation to workplace amenities. Regulators are not prioritising their activities around this risk, and they're not understanding, which made us question who's advising them and perhaps who is training their inspectorate. And on further investigation, what we found is that they are severely limited in their regulatory powers, which brings us to the law. The laws in this country simply do not provide prescriptive minimum requirements for workplace amenities which ensure they are regularly serviced, accessible, suitable, and open for all workers. Too much is left to interpretation. So our report makes 10 recommendations to address these key themes. Our first two recommendations focus at the top because we need to fix this from the top. That is fixing the laws. The primary legislation across all states, territories, and the Commonwealth need a clear and consistent framework that ensures that amenities are regularly serviced, accessible, suitable, and open. And the regulations that sit under that legislation need to provide the necessary detail to provide guidance on proper identification of the risks and the hazards. And the codes of practice need to be enforceable and address the differences in how amenities are needed to be accessed safely by different workers. Our recommendations in the second set looked at the regulator, empowering and then holding the safety regulators to account, making sure they prioritise education, compliance and enforcement activities relating to the provision of adequate workplace amenities, and particularly in remote and regional workplaces, making sure that the prescribed bodies who advise regulators include proper representation of the workers. The regulators' activities are supposed to protect, including women on their advisory bodies, and then updating their regulatory checklists on workplace amenities to make sure that those checklists are indeed fit for purpose and will address these risks. Lastly, our recommendations are focused towards industry, and it's about improving the industry for all workers. And largely what we saw is that we needed to ensure employers provide adequate amenities in the broadest possible terms. It's not just a toilet. It's proper service toilets, it's appropriate crib rooms, it may be shade, it may be water. It's a whole range of issues that are not being provided adequately. It's also about removing the cultural and systemic barriers through appropriate supports and education, and making sure that everyone understands the risks including workers who may be unaffected or affected differently by the provision of amenities in a workplace. Lastly, our report contains a couple of appendices, which you can take a look at, where we did a bit of an analysis of the comparison of the laws across all the states and territories and how those laws and the regulators who enforce them perform against our recommendations. It's pretty obvious when you take a look, they just don't stack up. So that's where all of you come in. Laws don't change by themselves, and there'll be an opportunity to get involved to help change those laws. So on that note, I'll hand back to Alan, who can speak to the next steps and also introduce our next guest, who I'm pretty sure has a little bit of experience on how to change laws. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Trevor. And again, appreciate the work that you've done on this. Obviously, there's a lot of work that needed to go into this, a lot of interviews, a lot of comments, collating those information, looking at the legislation to obviously get it in the format that it is. And as Trevor indicated, it's now in the chat side on the right-hand side of the Zoom conference, Zoom webinar. If you want to click on it and download it and save it, that would be great. And as Trev's indicated, in there's 10 key recommendations that have been made, and we say they need to be supported by state, territory and federal governments to ensure that they're enshrined in law. And that's where, as Trevor said, that yous play a big role in this. The union obviously will go out and will campaign, and we want your support to try and ensure that those state, territory and federal governments are strongly encouraged to pick up our recommendations and enshrine them in law. So that way we've got a vehicle to ensure that there is compliance in workplaces. Before I go to the steps that we can deal with that, I should have said this at the start, and it was remiss of me to not acknowledge this, but Senator Marise Payne, who's the Minister for Women in the federal government, was invited to attend this, what we believe is a very important webinar, but unfortunately she didn't respond. And that gives me even more cause to encourage everyone to do whatever they can. And the way what we're going to assist in lobbying governments is in 2 weeks' time at 6 p.m. on Wednesday, the 1st of September. The ETU will be holding a workshop to discuss practical tips on how to reach out to your local representatives and how together, collectively, we can take action to address this issue in the workplace. The link will be posted in the Q&A for you to register, and it'll also be mailed out to all of those who have registered for today's session. And again, it'll be provided on social media. So I just encourage you to register if you haven't done so already, because that way we can obviously provide you further information as the campaign develops, and also encourage you to attend that workshop on the 1st of September at 6 p.m. Our next guest that I want to introduce is obviously someone that's been passionate about women and women's rights for a long period of time. Tanya Plibersek is the Shadow Minister for Education, Shadow Minister for Women, and the Federal Member for Sydney. Tanya served as a Cabinet Minister in the Gillard-Rudd governments. Tanya was Minister for Health, Minister for Medical Research, Minister for Housing, Minister for Human Services, Minister for Social Inclusion, and Minister for the Status of Women. Since Tanya was elected as an MP for Sydney in 1998, she's worked tirelessly together with people in her local community for push for positive change. Over the years, she's campaigned for a return to social justice in government on issues such as paid parental leave, fair rights at work, and rights for same-sex couples. We've asked Tanya to come along tonight and give her perspective obviously from a federal political perspective. And I just want to acknowledge that Tanya's been a great friend of the ETU for a long period of time. And whenever we've reached out to her in the past, she's certainly been receptive and assisted us. So really appreciate you being here tonight with us, Tanya, and welcome.
Thanks, Alan. I'm really delighted to be asked to launch the report tonight. It's just fantastic work that the union's done. So I want to start, first of all, by acknowledging that I'm on the land of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. I know we've got different people parts of Australia, so hi to all of you. I particularly want to acknowledge the affirmative action officers of the ETU and the women's committees, the members of the ACTU Women's Committee, and the women in male-dominated occupational industries, and to all of the mighty women of the ETU. It's fantastic to be with you tonight. Can I just check?
Tanya, can I just, sorry, Tanya,
Yeah.
your video's just come off.
I don't know why that has happened, but there we go. I fixed it. I'm like Christopher Pyne. Do you remember when he said in the Parliament, "I'm the fixer"? Yeah. It's great. So it's great to be with all of you and with all of the mighty women of the ETU. Thank you so much for being pioneers in your industry, in your union, and for women throughout Australia. I think the last few months have been super hard for all of us. There've been closures and disruptions in people's work. I know that that's been hurting a lot of people, and so I hope that your members and anybody who's listening tonight have been able to keep as many shifts as possible, or at least get the sort of financial support that we need in these really difficult times. I would really have liked to meet with you in person tonight. I really enjoy coming to your union functions and seeing you face to face. And to be honest, there's nothing better than a room full of ETU women and women from the electrical sector talking to you about the challenges that you face and the sort of solutions you need from governments, from regulators, and from employers. We work in lots of ways, I suppose, in quite different worlds, but I can tell you, listening to your speakers tonight, I understand that there's many more similarities than differences as well, because, you know, I work in a pretty male-dominated environment as well. It's changed a lot since I started, but when I started, about 1 in 4 Labor MPs were female. Now we're at almost 50%. But when you look across the parliament, the numbers are still pretty low, not as low as in your industry, but still pretty low. And I guess one of the things I'd say is the fact that the numbers have increased in the Labor Party has been the result of a lot of deliberate action, a lot of setting targets and holding ourselves to account. And in many ways, I think what we've achieved proves that change can happen. We see it in lots of ways throughout society, in the jobs and careers that are now available to women, and the expectations and hopes that we have for young girls. You know, in the electrical sector, I think part of this transition that's really been happening to our society for many years now. It's hard being pioneers. The women who are online tonight and who are listening tonight, those, you know, the women in this union, you are pioneers, you are paving the way. But it's not that long ago that there wasn't many female doctors or lawyers or architects. It's really not that long ago that there were hardly any female union officials. There were hardly any visible female sports stars. Like, think about football, right? We've now got the AFLW. You look at the stadiums when the women are playing and they're packed. We've got the Matildas producing people like Sam Kerr, now household names. You would not have thought 10 years ago that 50,000 people would turn up to a women's AFL game. And, you know, it's not that long ago when TV executives were saying, we're not going to broadcast it because nobody's interested. But you now have kids, boys and girls, who will happily cheer Buddy Franklin, but also Erin Phillips, Nate Fife, also Taylor Harris. If you think about the way football is a religion in Victoria, for example, this is like the Catholics electing a female pope, but it is happening. Like, these changes have happened in our lifetimes, you know, recently in the last few years. So we've got to celebrate wins when we have them. We have to acknowledge change when it happens. That's how we keep people motivated, actually. If you feel like everything's hopeless, you think, why am I bothered why am I going to bother engaging in this battle? It's all hopeless, nothing ever changes. So you have to celebrate the wins as they happen, at the same time, obviously, as acknowledging that there's still so much to do. There's still so much gender inequality in our workplaces, in our homes, in our communities. So I want to acknowledge the challenges that your female members face. You really are, lots of you swimming against the tide. It's exhausting. But I think it really is only ever the sort of hard work and collective action that you're proposing through this report that really makes things change. And I've got to say, even working in a pretty sexist environment myself, I did find the reading of this report pretty shocking. Women's toilets, where they do exist, are often unsafe, unhygienic, unsanitary, remote, poorly lit. Work sites with no female toilets. Women not drinking during the day because they're worried about having to use the toilets, and not drinking for 12 hours of a shift. No sanitary disposal arrangements on site. Health risks like dehydration, toxic shock syndrome, urinary tract infections, and as well as the other sort of issues like the unisex PPE that doesn't fit women's bodies, heads or faces properly, women having to drive off-site to use public toilets at petrol stations. I mean, these stories, they just should, these things should not happen in an Australian workplace, a modern Australian workplace. And so the fact that this could be a barrier to women signing up to work in your industry, again, is shocking. We look around saying, how can we get more women into non-traditional industries? Well, man, if you if you don't know if there's going to be a bathroom at your work site, that's a bit of a barrier. It was certainly very similar in Parliament House, in the old Parliament House, not that long ago. In fact, our old Parliament House, when it was built in 1927, had no women's toilets for members of Parliament because they just didn't expect that there would ever be any female members of Parliament. And then in 1943, when Enid Lyons was the first female member of Parliament and Dorothy Tangney was the first senator, they came to Parliament. There was just over 100 members of the House of Representatives and senators. There were no women's toilets. They had to use the staff toilets. But, you know, really what you're saying is what the message of that is: we never expected women to be elected. You don't really belong here. We don't expect you'll be around for long anyway. That is the same message that women on building sites are being given today. You don't really belong here. We never expected you to get here. You'll hang around long anyway. That is the message if we don't build proper facilities for them to use. It took 31 years to change this in the federal parliament. It wasn't until 1974 when two female senators actually complained about there being no female toilets for senators. They converted a male toilet. They kind of boxed in the urinal in a men's toilet on the Senate side. But when Jeanette McHugh was the first woman elected from New South Wales to the House of Representatives in 1983, there was still no women's toilet for female members of the House of Representatives. It is kind of unbelievable, isn't it, that, you know, what's that, 60 years after the parliament was built, they hadn't got around to that. You think about the message that sends. I think the only reason it changed was because those women senators just started walking in to the men's bathrooms. Now, I'm not suggesting, I'm sure plenty of you have done that in the past. I, in fact, got a little bit of trouble myself when they opened the new entertainment centre when I went into the men's bathrooms there, because couldn't believe that in this new building, the new convention centre, they still didn't have enough toilets for women to go in a break in a performance. Unbelievable. But what I have learnt from working in a male-dominated environment is it takes a lot of persistence and a lot of resilience, and you know, my view is that we women are actually stronger than a lot of the men that we work with, because we're all doing the same work, but we've got these additional hurdles, I suppose, before we even get to the front door. I thought it was interesting to see in the ETU survey of its female members, 80% felt they had work-related issues that were different from their male colleagues. 69% felt isolated or excluded because of their gender. 68% felt like they'd been judged by their appearance rather than their ability, and 51% reported harassment they believed was gendered. I reckon if we did a similar survey in the federal parliament, we'd still find pretty similar results to that. It can get to you after a while. I know that it can, but I think if you're doing something you love, that you're committed to, that you're good at, and you want to make a difference for the women who came after you, that's a really strong motivator. And the thing that motivates me and has all my life in working in a pretty male environment is I just think I deserve my place here. I'm not giving my place away for anyone just because it gets hard. So I really want to congratulate those of you who are taking up this battle, not just for yourselves, but for the people who come after you. We really want to give more women more opportunities. That's why we've introduced affirmative action in the Labor Party, but it's also why we've made sure that we change the Labor Party so that there are spaces for women to support other women, structures for women to support other women. And I think I see that with the union as well, and I really want to congratulate you for doing that. I don't think that the Parliament and the Labor Party would be as good as it is, except for the fact that we have deliberately included and recruited more women. Like we announced our childcare policy recently, and that policy would make childcare cheaper for 97% of Australian families. It is no accident that one of the big reasons for that is because we've got young mums, young parents, but young mums in particular in the Labor Party. We make better decisions for working families because we look more like the working families that we represent. We know that, most of us have either experienced in our own working lives, or many Labor MPs obviously have been union representatives or activists in the past. We have lived experience of the gender pay gap. There's a reason that we want to direct Fair Work Australia to give better pay rises to low-paid workers, particularly those in female-dominated industries, and that we understand what casual workers and gig economy workers are going through. There's a reason that we have such a strong commitment to acting on women's safety, including 10 days paid domestic violence leave. Some of us have lived experience of domestic violence, but many more, like me, have worked in the field, and we know what a difference it would make to someone who's fleeing a violent relationship to actually have time to change the locks on the doors, to go and see the police, to make a statement, and get ready for a court appearance. We know what a difference 10 days paid domestic violence would leave would make. And just finally, right now, in the next week, going into Parliament, we've got legislation from the government that is supposed to put in place the recommendations of the Respect at Work report that the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Kate Jenkins did this report and had 55 recommendations. The government said we support all the recommendations. And then they brought legislation to the Parliament that completely ignores 14 recommendations and stuffs up a bunch of others. So we'll have many amendments to that Respect at Work legislation that the government's proposing, because we know how toxic and damaging sexual harassment in the workplace can be, and gender-based harassment. So that's why it's really important for women to feel confident to go into non-traditional male-dominated areas. It's why it's important that we recognise that change is hard, but it happens, that we celebrate the changes as they happen, and that we pave the way, we make it a little bit easier for the next generation and the next generation of women who follow us. So thanks very much for inviting me to talk to you tonight.
Thanks very much, Tanya. Again, very well spoken, and appreciate the experiences you shared with us, and also the history about Parliament House. I made a speech in Sydney and obviously called out Parliament House as probably being, well, not probably, being one of the worst workplaces in this country. And, you know, it's a shocking state of affairs. So we've got a federal government that's not prepared to act appropriately. And obviously, like you said, the legislation that's coming through now, the ALP will keep the bastards honest, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done with respect to getting that back in the place it should be. And also, you know, the bit of motivation for some of our attendees that are listening to the webinar tonight to continue to keep fighting, no matter what, to leave a legacy there for other people. And that's the start of this for us. Obviously, as a union, we want to try and be able to demonstrate that we can make meaningful change. And that comes about through legislative change. And we've really got to force the state and territory and federal governments to get off their asses and do more in this space. And that report is very confronting. And I appreciate your honesty with respect to some of the things that you called out in that, because most people in society wouldn't expect any person, whether they be male or female, to go through a process and have to, you know, put themselves at risk in all of those circumstances that you've raised tonight. So I do, again, appreciate your honesty and your openness about your experiences. And hopefully you can hang around, and we're going to go to a Q&A session now for all of our panelists. So you've got up on the top of your screen there, you can see your panelists, but obviously Tanya's here, Alan McNally, Trevor and Izzy. What I would ask you is to do, if you can, use the Q&A button down the bottom. If you can, if you've got a specific question for one of the panelists, if you could just certainly type their first name in to the question, and then we'll do the best we can to moderate these questions. And as I said, we've also got our comms person, Emma, that she'll try and address some of the questions for you and try and make it as smooth as possible. So please feel free now to use this opportunity to ask any of the panelists any questions that you may have. So there's a first question here that I'll just start throwing a few to the panelists. So Trevor, this one's going to be for you, mate. Have other states ever heard of peeing on the back tyre of a truck as being legislated?
Urban legend. So there's an interesting article, I think news.com put up a couple of years ago. A journalist went through a whole bunch of these kinds of urban legend questions, but when you go across all states and territories, in one way or another, urinating on the back rear tyre of your vehicle is an offence.
Thanks, mate. Tanya, you answered somewhat of this, obviously, in your presentation, but there's been a question here, if you can probably elaborate a little bit further, but what's the Labor Party going to do about this report and these recommendations if they get into power?
Are we talking about your report now? Or
yeah, that's correct. The recommendations that have arisen out of our report.
Look, I can't answer completely. Tony Burke is our Shadow Minister for Industrial Relations, and because the report's only just been released, I'm sure Tony will read it and consider it and come back to you. But I can tell you that it just is uncivilised not to have proper bathroom facilities for women and men in any workplace. So we will work with your union. It's a strong union and a good union. We like working with the ETU. I'm sure we'll be able to work with you to honestly treat people with a bit of dignity and
Yep.
give them some decent facilities at work.
100%. And I think the more that we press ahead with this report and the more that we make it public, again, I think that when people pick this up and look at it and they read some of those real life experiences that people have gone through, they are going to be shocked that this is still happening in society today. Trevor, back to you again, mate. Thanks, Tanya. What sort of engagement or push with the regulators has occurred on this issue? And has there been any responses at this stage?
Thanks. So as I outlined earlier, when we did start to think about what is the regulator's response been to now, what we found fairly quickly is that not all regulators have advisory committees that include representatives of workers on them. So straight away, that's a bit of a gap. And then second to that, where those advisory committees do exist, they don't have working groups or subcommittees that particularly deal with women in male-dominated occupational industries. So straight away, that tells us that they're pretty blind to these issues. And then the third point is that the legislation just doesn't reinforce sufficient regulatory power for the regulator to deal with amenities as comprehensively as they should. It's the primary legislation is quite vague on this. Often it's left to codes of practice which aren't enforceable, and it varies a little bit from state to state. Or it falls back on things like building codes, which tend to work in fixed, permanent, established workplaces, but aren't particularly helpful for field workers, workers in the construction sector, workers in sort of the O&M maintenance out in the field, renewables type space. So there's quite a lot of gaps there. So absolutely, our branch at every state and territory engages with the regulators. The challenge for us always is the level of knowledge, experience and skill of the inspectorate and how much they might be being provided by an individual state or territory department. And then, of course, whether or not their legislation even gives them sufficient power to do what they need to do.
Thanks, Trev. And obviously part of this whole campaign is about driving that change and getting the legislative change and reform that we need so that we do have the capacity to enforce this through compliance. Alan, there's a question here for you. Would it be helpful if we report unhygienic toilets to the union as well as our workplace?
I think it would be. We've got some amazing wins in recent years. I know Sydney Trains, we've been able to get sanitary bins and establish a sanitary committee there with women who work in that workplace. And the more talk and the more conversation that we have and identifying where these issues are quite significant can lead to real change that we can see in our workplaces. And we certainly have a great team of organisers that, you know, when they know better, they're certainly able to get on that ground and make that change. So, yep, I think it's a great idea. Report it to your branch and have that conversation with your local organiser.
Yeah, thanks, Alan, 100%. There's a question about the ability for people to refuse to work at locations if it doesn't have the facilities. Absolutely, there is. It's a fundamental right of all workers that if there's a workplace that's unsafe, and it's up to the individual worker to determine what is safe and what isn't. So you have a reasonable right to refuse to work in areas that are unsafe. That's a legislative right at the moment. Obviously, in a practical sense, sometimes that becomes very difficult. If you're not provided with the amenities, you raise it, and then the employer wants to seek to tow and take action against you. That makes it difficult. But certainly you do have a right to refuse work if you believe that it's unsafe. Trevor, back to you again, mate. Can having sanitary bins and shared toilets be brought in as something needed, not as a luxury, like I've been told?
Yeah, the myth of special privileges or special additional things for women and how inconvenient that is a pretty frustrating one. You know, in my workplace, when I go to the bathroom, I've got a urinal. I don't necessarily need one. I could get by without one, but it's not a special privilege. These are just bare minimum essentials that workers should have in their workplace. And for women workers, they access toilets for different reasons to men, and they should have those minimum kinds of things supplied in their workplace. It's not hard. And in our experience, often when you go to the corporate headquarters of the employer that you're working for, you'll find those amenities are pretty spiffy. But for the field workers, it's falling a long way behind. So absolutely, it should be a mandatory minimum.
Thanks, mate. There's a question raised here that identifies obviously that employers or bosses are definitely the key problem, but it's a question about what's the TU doing to make it clear to male members that their behaviour is inappropriate. Well, obviously, what we want our female members to do and our women members to do is to clearly call it out, and then we also want our male members to support them in that. So if there is inappropriate behaviour going on in the workplace, then we want you to have the courage, as you have done in the past and you'll continue to keep doing in the future, to call it out. But we also want our male members to provide you that support and give you that confidence that you can do that. And certainly from an organiser's perspective, I would obviously expect that if organisers were getting phone calls about inappropriate behaviour in a workplace, then they'd want to seek to investigate that and look into that urgently. So I hope, you know, we can continue to keep providing some confidence for you guys to ensure that if there is issues in the workplace, no matter what they are, that you have the capacity and confidence to call them out, and that the ETU will make it clear that we will support you in that. There's a question here. Hi all, as a field worker, I know local knowledge in relation to location of public toilets and their condition is key. I would like to know if it's possible to have a phone app or register that we can all add to put locations in and write reviews. Not a perfect solution, but will give people the choice to access clean facilities while working on the road and community. We can include things such as pairing rooms for milk expression, sanitary disposal facilities and security privacy conditions, and also opening hours. That's Trev, I'll throw that over to you, but I mean, there's certainly something that we can have a look at with respect to that.
Yeah, thanks. So I think with both Peter's question there and Jason Laley, I noticed to put in something similar about a proposed solution. And so in general terms, what I would say is that whilst we want the legislation to have these minimum requirements, of course, it needs to be applied in a way that's fit for purpose and practical in workplaces, and that's going to vary across the way. But these are excellent two suggestions I would suggest, but it's probably would be great to hear from Izzy or Alan for their thoughts on some of these solutions or some of the solutions they may have seen in their workplaces.
I'm happy to kind of address a little bit of that. I think that women in the workplaces quite often will discuss with one another about solutions about already navigating the very, very difficult like access issues. There is not a single tradeswoman that I've ever met in my life where we haven't had a discussion about toilets and sanitary bins. And where they're a mother expressing breast milk, we all share this difficulty of access and we all talk about different ways of dealing with it. I have women who work in the domestic sector who invest in period undies because they visit clients' homes and don't know what, how, or when they can dispose of sanitary items when they visit people's homes on a regular basis to attend emergency breakdowns, repair things in people's homes. On remote work, we talk about what She-Wee products have you used, what menstrual cups have you used. We already kind of share this information very openly amongst ourselves, but the burden is always on us as women workers, and the burden of the financial aspects of this is always on us personally as well as our time. So I can't claim she/we on taxes. I can't go to my employer and say, you need to pay for period undies because I need this as a part of the difficulty to access amenities in my workplace. Whereas we should have frameworks in place where we can talk to our employer, where we can access better amenities, more proper technological advances that are freely available to us, and not have to wear the burden of finance and time on us as individual workers.
Thanks, Izzy. Alan, have you got some views on that?
I agree with Izzy. It was interesting. I was having a conversation with a co-worker in Sydney today, and he was talking about a toilet in Emu Plains. Now, I don't get to Emu Plains very often, but I know about that toilet to show how much we know about how where to go and where not to go, I guess is the right answer. Look, there certainly needs to be less onus on women to find the answer to the problems. We're very good at finding workarounds, whether that be the male boss that doesn't want to talk to you nicely because he doesn't think you're suitable to have the job and you're a job stealer, or whether it's asking that, you know, you can have a sanitary bin. But it doesn't resolve the issue. The issue is still there. It's just an interim fix. So certainly in some occupations, particularly when you're working remotely in different locations all the time or in the truck, it certainly could make sense. But I think it's part of the solution, not the answer to the problem.
Yeah, thanks very much. There's been a question made about where the report can be or where we can point the general public to. It's available on the ETU national website. So if people want to go there and they can get it, or alternatively, like we said, we put it in the chat. We're happy for you to copy it, download it, and then make it available to other people. But it'll certainly be publicly available on our website. I'm just looking through some other questions here. Trev, with respect to the proposal and the recommendations, are you looking at us and the regulator to justify why it hasn't brought a prosecution for breach of employer duties?
Yeah, we did turn our mind a little bit to some of those approaches, and the challenge of course, I think the two women identified in the earlier, where Izzy and Alan were explaining the sort of the culture of whispering. So whether or not we can find clear examples where the employer has breached, and then connecting that to a clear report to the regulator, and then connecting it again then to a lack of action. So that is challenging, but I think that's definitely things that we should explore. In the lead up to this launch, we were asking ETU members to share with us some of those horror stories and photos, and I suppose the natural evolution of that is to move from taking a snap of a dodgy dunny to looking for those case studies that we can pursue, and that'll need to be done at a branch by branch level, but absolutely that's an option that we should look to pursue.
Okay, thanks, Trev. Probably going to start, if you've got any further questions that you've got, I've just been mindful of the time and just wondering if there's no other further questions. I can't see any further coming through at this stage. So what I might do is, I just want to obviously thank everyone for their attendance tonight. Particular thanks to our panelists, Izzy, Trev, Alan and Tanya. I really appreciate your time and your efforts that you put into tonight to help shape some of the discussions that we've had. Also want to acknowledge and thank every single attendee who's participated and provided questions in the Q&A session. With everything, there's always an ask. We want you to go away and give strong consideration to registering for the workshop that we're holding in 2 weeks' time on the 1st of September at 6 p.m. And that'll give you an opportunity to discuss some practical tips on how we can further put pressure on, state, territory and federal governments to do the right thing in this space. Obviously, as I said before in my remarks, the link's been posted there. It's still on the side, in the right-hand side. So if you can register, and if you're interested to get further more information on the union about this campaign, please do so. And I obviously look forward to working with each and every one of you to continue this work, to make sure we get the necessary changes that are much needed in our workplace. The 10 recommendations that we've put together need to be supported by state, territory and federal governments. And they need to be enshrined in law. So we do have a vehicle that we can go out, and if there is unscrupulous employers doing the wrong thing and not complying with legislation, then we have the capacity to take them to task. And, you know, I again applaud the people that contributed information to this report. I applaud Izzy, Alan and Tanya with their experiences that they've been, you know, dealing with in their employment over the years that they've been involved in the workplace. So again, I sincerely thank you for your efforts. Everyone, please stay safe. We're living in difficult times with what's happening with COVID. But I really look forward to our work together to make that meaningful change in our workplaces and in our society. So thanks very much and good night.